Happy to have you here this afternoon, and this program is being sponsored by Beyond Burning by the Reset organization, as well as by the League of Women Voters and Sierra Club and the EcoAlliance. And I think that's everybody, isn't it?
Energy Justice Network.
Energy Justice Network, of course. And I'm Gary Robbins, president of the board of Reset, and I would like to introduce the second vice president, Marcia Ellis, second vice president of the League of Women Voters, who is the power behind this, and she's got the power to do all kinds of things. So we welcome her big time. Thank you.
Good afternoon. It's so great to be here today with you all. And I am going to give up a little bit of a prelude into our main speaker, Mike Ewall of Energy Justice. And so we have been forming a coalition on this issue that continues to grow larger all of the time. In fact, Mike is here back in town for his third trip in the past year and a half, and forming up a coalition of the 8 incinerator communities, 9 if you count the medical waste incinerator in Apopka, throughout the state of Florida, so that we can share experiences. So what brought Mike Ewall to Florida? Oh, great. Let's go back one minute. Do I need to do something here? So while Mike is working out the technical issue for us, I want to talk a little bit about how I got to know him. So I got to know Mike Ewall because we had an issue at our Buckingham waste to energy plant, AKA the trash incinerator, after Hurricane Ian here in Lee County. We had a problem. And so I was at a Board of County Commissioners meeting, and an item came through the consent agenda that had asked the Lee County and the operator at the time, Covanta, to pay a $2,000 fine because they had exceeded dioxin and furan emissions twice, not just once, but twice. And we'll talk about that a little bit more. And so my thought was, I knew what mercury was. I knew how harmful mercury was, but I didn't really know anything about dioxin. But I came to find out that dioxin is, in fact, the world's most dangerous chemical. And at that point, I started looking into it. I started reading a little bit about what dioxin is, looking at the B side of the incinerator narrative. And that led me to read Mike's work and to eventually pick up the phone and call him. And let me tell you, he picked up the phone right away. And I felt so much better. And I was no longer alone. I had someone to help me navigate this really big lift and this tough issue and get to the bottom of what was happening with our incinerator out in Buckingham. This mattered to me because I had taught school 2.5 miles from this incinerator for over 10 years. So these weren't just anonymous people in the community. These were the kids I taught, the community that I had served for over 10 years. Let me see, how am I going to advance? Okay, thank you. All right, so what was Mike doing at this time? Well, Mike had come to Florida because the incinerator over in Miami Dade had caught on fire in February of 2023. And over a 3-week period of time of constant burning, literally burned to the ground, ashes. And so that took place in the Doral area of Miami. And Mike was brought into town to assist with the where they were going to rebuild that incinerator. And he and I were on an intersect, right? I was calling him, asking him for help, and he was becoming active in Florida. Let's see, is it this one? I have to put my glasses on. Oh, thank you. All right, this is a little bit of it shows you a little bit about our particular incinerator here in town, because we like to keep it local. And you can see from the aerial that we have a community park complete with a playground and the whole baseball complex literally adjoining the incinerator. And that's a pretty frightful concept, really, when you think about it. It also, I think, shows our arrogance somewhat as a community, that we just accepted this narrative blankly. So what happened? We have 3 total burners. 2 of the burners at this incinerator are from 1994. The third one is from 2007. It was the 2007 burner that had the problem. This shows a little bit bigger of a picture in terms of the surrounding community. We have all of those houses in Centennial Park area of Lehigh. We have the agricultural area with a lot of chickens and meat animals within proximity, which can be troublesome. And we have, as I said, we have a high school and we have a middle school, Varsity Lakes Middle School and Lehigh Senior. As part of our solid waste infrastructure and complex, we take the ash from the incinerator, and that ash is hauled out to the Hendry County landfill, which is pretty much just right across the line. You can kind of see where Lehigh Acres starts and Hendry County starts, and that's where they put the ash. Also, as part of our complex and as an incinerator issue that is pressing in this community, has been a proposal to build a second incinerator that would serve North Lee County on the other side of the Caloosahatchee River, as well as Charlotte County. And the suggested location for that is at the Zimmel Road landfill. Each of these incinerator locations that are in Florida, the 8 communities have their own flavor. The flavor at the Zimmel Road landfill is sewage sludge, because we have a ton of it being hauled in there from many cities, many big cities, St. Petersburg, Sarasota, Marco, Naples, MacDill Air Force Base. All of these places are sending their sewage sludge also to that landfill, and that creates a certain character to what could potentially be incinerated there if this were to go through. This shows a little bit more that we have some agricultural areas, kind of like Buckingham, pretty close, but we also have the whole burnt store community. And we know how that has been in the news over and over again, and it's exploding in that part of our community up on the Lee-Charlotte line. So this shows the significant non-compliance at our Buckingham incinerator. They tested it, and then they retested it, and then finally the third time it passed. However, one of the things I've learned is that the rules that govern incinerators were literally written by the incinerator industry, and they have written themselves in an exception for malfunction. So think about that, an exception for malfunction. And that's pretty much what they said, what Covanta, now they renamed themselves Reworld after the Miami fire, had said in their letter. So we also have a lot of increase in mercury from this facility. You can kind of see that, how that has been on the upswing. One of the big issues has been this past year, Lee County voted for an $85 million end of life extension, because these things are done at 30 years and ours turned 31. So this took place without going out to Buckingham and asking the folks out there how they feel about having this incinerator continue in their community, or giving us all a chance to talk about what the future of solid waste looks like here in Lee County. And I just wanted to take a moment.
Can you go back to that best one?
Sure.
Let's point out the scary part of that one.
Here's Mike Ewall. He's going to come up here, and this is one of the graphs that he made in analyzing all of the incinerators in Florida. And this is a nice segue. So Mike is here from Philly, and he is runs a nonprofit called Energy Justice. And I will take a seat and let him jump right on this. Mike, can you get closer to the computer with your voice?
Gotcha. All right, nice. Got it. Okay.
And
So, thank you. So hi, everybody. Good to be back here. This here's a chart I made based on data from your state government that comes from your county government in the case of this incinerator and other often county-owned incinerators. It's data that is reported by the trash incinerator owners to the state. And so we didn't make this up. I just put it on a chart. And you can see that the black line at the top, that's the total amount of mercury coming out of the smokestacks after the pollution controls of all incinerators for trash in Florida. The reason why this line is so big most of these years is because the biggest one in the state, the one in Pinellas, had just off the charts crazy levels of mercury. They seem to have gotten that under control somewhat. It's still one of the worst ones. The second to Lee County in red. And for some reason in the last few years, the data after 2020, we see this rising trend of mercury coming out of the smokestack of the incinerator in your county. So it's now the worst as of this latest data. We're going to check soon, see if maybe 2024 data is out yet. But the 2023 data shows it's the worst in the state for this. So, yes.
Just be specific on what each line represents.
Each one is a different incinerator, although the black line at the top is the total. And the rest of them are one incinerator each. The red one that you see is Lee County. The green one is Pinellas. Everything else is lower. Got it? All right. I'm not aware of what they might have done that has reduced that, but it's a great question. It does seem extreme to see the numbers that we saw before. Now, I'll also point out, as I'll be pointing out later, that this is all based on once a year testing. And so they're taking a snapshot during their best behavior once a year and saying, this is what we're like all year. And let's just extrapolate from there. So that's how a lot of this stuff works, unfortunately. That's hard to know because we only have one data point per year. And so we have one data point per year per plant.
When is it?
Whenever each one schedules it. We don't know that. We'd have to dig into each one's files.
still Mike's thunder here, but they're only also testing one burner and Pinellas has
Well,
6.
Well, that's for dioxin. Dioxin is just, yeah, we'll get into that later. Let's do that later.
Be burning hurricane debris from what I've been able to discover. And I tried to call EPA about that last week, but they're not picking up the phone there. So let's keep that in mind too, because I think that is an important community conversation. We know that a community is already burdened with taking on all of our municipal waste. Is it fair to be hauling hurricane debris in there as well? And what is the wear and tear? So that's a great question.
All right, so let's start at my first slide. You will probably have lots of questions. I don't mind taking some here or there throughout. This will take a while longer if we do that, or we can save them until the end. So if you're willing to write them down and save them to them, that's fine. But if it's like, I need to ask about this slide, that's okay. You could do some of that. Okay, so the word incinerator is something that the industry has learned is a term that people understand to be negative. And so they have rebranded so many times, it's kind of ridiculous. That when I got started in this in the early 1990s, it was trash to steam. And I was still in high school and I was hearing that they were going to build a trash to steam plant in my community. And I was for it. I thought it was a great idea because that's all I knew. And what I saw in the newspaper and the propaganda that was in my school all told me it was a good thing. Then, of course, I got pulled into the community involvement in this and started reading up on it and realized that that's not what it's actually doing, that we're not just throwing ice cubes in trash cans and having water vapor come out of smokestacks. That would be steam, where there's a lot more coming out than just steam. So then they rebranded to waste to energy. They also, I missed one on here. They also used to call them resource recovery facilities. That is a term that used to mean recycling, but now plants like yours and most of them around the country have resource recovery facility in their name. And then we see waste to energy as if somehow bad things are just magically turning into good things. And waste goes in, energy comes out, and that's all we're supposed to think about. So that's a very good public relations twist for them. and they've been using that for many years. Then they switched it to energy from waste to kind of put the good part first. And now, as of April 2024, when the company Covanta that runs your incinerator changed their name to Reworld, they rebranded the whole technology name that they use, and now they're thermomechanical treatment facilities. So just know that these are all the same thing. These are all public relations terms for trash incinerators, which are the most expensive and polluting way to manage waste or to make energy. There are some other terms that can apply to different types of waste to energy facilities. They're waste to fuels. I love that they have an acronym problem and other fun terms. So this here, as Marcia was describing, we took this picture when I was last out here. This is the playground. There were kids here. I just waited till they were gone, so I didn't like do that without their permission. But kids play on this playground in the shadow of this trash incinerator. That's one of the more extreme examples I've seen. I did see one later in Apopka with a medical waste incinerator with a playground on their property for a Black neighborhood right across the street. The picture wasn't as good because there were trees in the way, but still, this is a thing that happens, and this is inexcusable in terms of protecting public health. Now, this here is one of the first pages of the permit, not for this incinerator, but for another one owned by a county, run by the same company on the other side of the state in Palm Beach County. We have to dig up this one, it'll look the same. But what they say in here is that the incinerator is a major source of hazardous air pollution. Those are legal terms, major source and hazardous air pollution. This is in writing. This isn't like this crazy guy that came in from Philadelphia and told me incinerators are the worst thing ever. This is your state government's permit document. They're saying they are a major source of hazardous air pollution because that is what they are and that's how they're regulated. So when we look at the data that they report, this is, as we'll talk about more later, based often on underestimated data from once-a-year testing for most pollutants. But what we find with this data is that, and this is the latest available from EPA that we can compare to other facilities in the county. So you'll see how many pounds, the first one's global warming pollutants, so that's actually in metric tons, but the rest are pounds of pollution that they're putting out into your air. This is just in the 1 year, 2020. It doesn't start over each year. It adds to the previous year. So you have 31 years of this amount per year being dumped into your air and falling onto your waterways and farm fields and properties. And you can see that they're number 1, 2, or 3 ranked in the county for each of these pollutants. So even though you have airports putting a lot of certain things out, you have a big power plant burning, I think, natural gas or fracked gas more likely, to compete with, and that's a much bigger facility. So for some pollutants, you know, that's number 1, and then incinerators number 2 or 3. But there's no question that this is in the top 3 of the largest industrial air polluters for all these different pollutants that you see here. And there are a lot more pollutants that come out. These are just the ones that are showing up in a database. Other ones are either not tested or they're tested in the numbers like dioxins, the most toxic chemicals known to science, don't show up in the database. So there's more to it than this, but this is a significant polluter. This is not just like, oh yeah, that's the one thing, oh, it can't be that bad maybe, right? It is that bad. It's one of the worst. And when we look at the health impacts to communities from trash incinerators, what we find is that there are increased levels of cancers in general, and a lot of specific cancers have been studied and found elevated around trash incinerators. There are respiratory diseases that are elevated, cardiovascular, urinary diseases, there are birth defects, and there are a number of other health effects I didn't put on this slide yet, but I just did a report a few months ago. There are about 7 pages of just densely summarizing study, found this, and citing all of these studies from around the world, showing that there are health effects, even from the so-called modern ones. You don't have one of those, but even from the so-called modern ones that industry likes to say, like in Broward County, when a consultant came back and said, oh, we looked at the academic literature of this and found that, you know, there are no things to worry about in terms of health. Like, yeah, those older ones, there are some health problems, but those modern ones are just fine. That's what they said. And that's when the city of Miramar hired me to do a report to debunk that, and I did. And that report is what I'm summarizing from. I found that those county consultants who have a conflict of interest and are pro-incinerator consultants, but they went and looked at 400 some studies, included 0 of them in the review, and picked secondary sources, 22 of them for their things. Some of them were blatantly from industry-funded sources, and cited and misquoted in some cases a number of documents that try to make their case that, oh, the new ones are not so bad. And then when you dig into it, you find that even some of their own things that they're misquoting, or actually they're quoting correctly, but some of the sources they're citing are misquoting their studies. I had to dig 4 levels deep in the footnotes and found that some of them are just completely misrepresenting the results and saying that in half the cases of these modern incinerators that they've actually found effects, they said they didn't find any. So this is the kind of information you get as a public when public agencies like Broward County's government gets consultants involved to tell you what is the reality of health effects around incinerators. And they confidently come to you, just like AI confidently gives false information all the time. You will hear confident statements saying that don't worry, be happy, there's nothing to worry about. These other people are just crazy, the science says. And yet here we are pointing out that they cited 0 peer-reviewed documents, even though their county mayor said, oh, I looked all of them up, I'm a librarian, and they're all peer-reviewed studies from around the world. 0 of them are peer-reviewed studies from around the world. And we studied like dozens of peer-reviewed studies that did find health effects. So you really have to have a good eye of skepticism for some of the things that you hear in this work. So it takes a lot of digging. It took a lot of hours just to dig 4 levels deep in footnotes and find out how they're deceiving us. Okay, so where are the trash incinerators in the US? I live in the middle of the crazy cluster you see. I'm from Philadelphia, in the middle of the worst cluster of trash incinerators in the country. There are 5 of them surrounding my city. But Florida is the incinerator capital. You used to be that you've got more incinerators than any other state, but one shut down, another shut down, and another burned down. So now you're down to 9. So New York has more, but yours are bigger. So you still burn more waste in Florida than any other state. Actually, 20% of all the trash burned in the whole country happens in Florida.
What was that? Wow.
20% of all the trash that is burned in the country happens in Florida. So you're number 1 in the amount of waste burned, number 2 in the number of trash incinerators now, but that could go back to number 1 because you have your county in Charlotte talking about building a new one. You got Miami-Dade talking about building the largest in the Americas to replace their old one. You've got Palm Beach County trying to replace their old one with a new one that's even bigger. And there's some other places like Pasco County that are expanding, adding boilers. So you've got a lot of waste burning going on here. And for this to be the most toxic, dangerous way and expensive way to manage waste or make energy is very concerning that this is the trend in this state going against the grain where everywhere else in the country is shutting them down and competing to keep them out and to close theirs and retire these old facilities. Almost all of them are old. Your state is trying to go in the wrong direction. It's number 1 in the number of proposals in the country. That's why I'm now down here for the 3rd time in the past year, touring around, trying to help communities understand what is going on. Now, one of the things that got me more deeply involved in work in Florida, we've had members and folks in the state going back a few decades on different issues, but on this issue in 2022, the Republican legislature passed a bill and your governor signed into law Senate Bill 1764, which initially I just stumbled into this. I was looking at the trade associations for this industry website, and they had the tweet on there that it was all excited about some bill in Florida. I'm like, oh, if they're excited, it must be bad. Let's see what it is. And I saw it was $100 million a year subsidies of your taxpayer money to pay for this industry. And then what happened as it unfolded, and we tried to speak out on it and get it stopped, but we couldn't overcome the pressure or power that they had. They took away that $100 million amount and just made it a blank check for half the cost of expanding or building a new incinerator, as long as it's publicly owned, which all but 2 of the incinerators, the trash incinerators in the state, are publicly owned. And one of them is the Broward County one, which is private, and they're trying to build like public stuff possibly. So they will be on this game. And so we're seeing price tags like Miami-Dade talking about a $2 billion new incinerator. Palm Beach County, a replacement that would be $1.5 billion. And half of that cost will come out of you as state taxpayers. So even though you're also paying for the county level and with your local taxes to subsidize an expensive, polluting old facility here in Lee County, you're going to be paying for the ones on the other side of the state if they build them. Even if you have no incinerators, you'll be helping pay for theirs if this law actually is passed, but if they actually appropriate money when it's time to actually build these. So this is something that needs to be changed politically at the state level. Thankfully, they have not put money into that pot yet, but at some point, those counties are going to be like, all right, we're ready to do the financing, call up their state legislators, get that in the budget bill, and it's going to impact you too. So I hope we can do what we can to continue building a statewide network around this and have a local group here to really contact your state legislators and push against this, no matter where in the state is being impacted by the facilities. All right, so let me jump to some positive news for a second. In Oregon, you're like, oh, like I'm just getting warmed up. So in Oregon, 2 years ago, there was a law that I helped write, state law, that required that any trash incinerators, they only have one. It also burns medical waste, like the one in Lake County, Florida does too, same company. Same company you have here, it's Covanta now called Reworld. So they burn trash and medical waste and industrial waste there. And the state law said that they have to continuously monitor for dioxins, furans, PCBs, and 9 toxic metals for only 12 months, not even indefinitely. They shut down for good in January of this year. They did that in part because of that law, and the timing made it clear that that law was the main reason of the 3 that the plant manager told me to my face is why they're shutting down. He didn't know I wrote the bill, but I was talking to him and he's like, yeah, this, and that bill, that was really terrible, bad design of a bill. Thanks. So that shows a bit that this industry is afraid of the real data coming out of how much they're putting into the air at these plants. So one of the things that we learned in the course of that, in 2024, there was a study done by scientists at the US Forest Service who saw a grassroots version of the study. They did like only 2 or 3 data points the grassroots group can afford, but they sampled moss. And they're like, what toxic metals are in the moss, like downwind at different distances of the incinerator? And they found closer to the incinerator, there were higher levels of toxic metals. And so these scientists were like, why don't we have the capability? Why don't we do a much better version of that study and get a lot more data points and sample for a lot more elements? And so they did. And they found a very strong correlation, including one of those metals being so exotic that it could only have come from that burning of medical waste. Gadolinium is not used in anything else, but in medical products, basically. And so they were able to show that, yes, that incinerator was causing metals to accumulate downwind with a large portion in the first kilometer, but going many more kilometers beyond that, they were finding those metals being elevated. So that's what we're talking about. You know, that's happening here too. It's just no one's studying it, but that same thing happens around any of these types of plants. Okay, so a good news piece again. This is the trend for this industry. This industry is shutting down. Their plants are getting old, like this one is, 31 now. And they're retiring. They're either burning down like in Miami-Dade, or they're getting too expensive to maintain, like in Montgomery County, Maryland, where you have another county-owned one that is run by the same company. But unlike here, they're like, that costs too much. And these activists have been telling us for a long time to shut it down. And, you know, they're right. We agreed with them years ago we would. So now that we see the price tag, yeah, I guess we should actually do that. So they're shutting those down in the next 12 months. Your county, though, is like, oh, big price tag to keep it going? Sure, let's pay it. So that's what's happening right now in a very similar situation. So we're down to 62 that are still operating. One just announced they're going to close down in about a year and a half. So we'll be down to 61. 60 once Montgomery County does as well. So more and more every year are closing because they're just aging out. They're getting expensive. They're falling apart and sometimes having big fires. So there's only one new one that was built in this time, in the past 30 years, since 1995. And that's West Palm Beach, the second one that they built. That's now 10 years old. But they've not, other than some expansions, they've not managed to get a new community to build an incinerator in 30 years. That one was right next to an existing one, but in terms of building new ones, they're not able to do it because people fight them. People like you get educated on this and realize this is a terrible idea. We need to stop our politicians from pursuing this. And they organize and they get it stopped. And that's what happens every time, despite hundreds of attempts. There are literally hundreds of times they tried to build new incinerators since 1995 at a new site, and they've gotten zero built. So we need to make sure that you don't break the trend here. Don't let a new one get built for you in Charlotte County and right across the line. But what we see is that the average lifespan of these, yes, go ahead.
So what's the concrete solution? If you get rid of them, what would you suggest
Yeah.
that the county?
That's coming later.
Yeah. it's-
We will get there. We'll get there. Trust me, we're good.
You got the idea, this is not a good thing.
Okay, you're gonna get some more idea on that, but then I'll answer your question. So the average lifespan of the 54 that closed since the turn of the century was just 26 years old. So yours is already 5 years past the prime. Very few of them make it past their 40th birthday, but a couple of them may pass 50, and one just announced that they're closing soon. So this is a dying industry, and we need to help it do that so we can move on. So here is a report that looks at what a new incinerator looks like. I see your hand. Give me a second. This is a report I did for the Sierra Club in Palm Beach County. And they were asking the question, what would it look like if they went ahead and built a new incinerator? How polluting would it be? Because they always say, oh, it's going to be the cleanest, greenest one ever. And what we found is that even when they go from an old facility to a new one with modern pollution controls and higher requirements, the ones that aren't even in effect yet, but are supposed to come out this December, they will have 5 pollutants actually increase because they're building it bigger. 5 others will decrease, but 5 will be increasing. So it's not like this is so clean and new and magical that nothing comes out. It will still be one of the largest industrial air polluters in Palm Beach County. And we found the same thing in Miami-Dade County when we studied similarly what would happen there. Yes, what was your hand about?
What I was gonna getting at, thank you for answering. Does the pollution increase with the age of the incinerator?
I don't know that anyone's actually studied it specifically on that. I think we can expect in some ways that would happen because you have increased malfunctions and breakdowns of equipment. But you also occasionally at some incinerators, they'll have to upgrade the pollution controls. So you might say, they would argue the opposite. They would say, oh, over time we get cleaner because, we've been forced to install these things, which usually is by force. They don't tend to voluntarily, clean up their act. So it depends on which pollutant and which way you're looking at it. But yeah, I think an argument can be made both ways. So yes, yes.
When someone is getting.
Sure, yeah, I'm a little warm. Yeah, that's fine. Sounds good. Oh, what happened to our? You got interesting ads going on. There we go. Cool, okay. All right, so another one of the studies that I did for the city of Miramar, because they're opposing the building of a new incinerator in Miami-Dade County next to them, and also in their own county, in Broward County, not far from them. And so we looked at the operating track record of the first 10 years of the new one, the shiny green one that Miami-Dade County called the cleanest and greenest. And this is the newer one that's 10 years old in West Palm Beach. And we found over 170 incidents just in that first decade. The ones in the cover photo here, those 5 are all just from last year and showing different things breaking down, having problems. And this is before we even got a chance to look at their inspection files, which will show a lot more. So there's probably well over 200 different violations, mishaps of various sorts. And the final study I did for that city, this is the first one actually I did for them, is where else could the waste go if we don't have an incinerator? So this partially answers your question. As we'll see in some of the next slides, incineration and sending that ash to a landfill is far more dangerous than just sending the trash without burning it first straight to the landfill. And so what we found is that I looked at every one of the landfills in Florida, plus all the ones in Georgia up to Atlanta, and ranked them across 18 different criteria to see which are the most responsible landfills that can be used. And it turned out that the ones they already have in Miami-Dade County are not some of the better ones. They're actually some of the worst ones. But the one that they are using now that their incinerator burned down the Okeechobee landfill was actually number one, the one that's closest to them, turned out to be the best of the options. And so it's not like you don't have landfills. You have landfills, even ones in and near your county right here, that could be used. And the challenge is, how do we end incineration, use those landfills, but manage them better than they already do, and then fill them as slowly as possible by doing all the zero waste solutions that we'll get into later slides. Okay, so cost. We talked about this a little bit, but the cost of incinerators is very, very high. They are the most expensive, as we talked about, and because of that, they require clauses in their contracts that are called put or pay clauses. These clauses say you give us a certain amount of waste, or you pay us as if you did anyway. Landfills don't need this kind of clause in their contract because you can fill them slower and make them last longer, and that's a good thing. But with incinerators, they're hungry machines that need to be fed. So their contracts make sure that they have a guaranteed flow of waste or dollars, so that if you don't have enough waste, say you do the right thing and you all recycle and compost and get rid of those styrofoam cups you had today, and you, sorry, I have to throw it in, and and you really reduce waste to the point where you're filling the incinerator slower. I see. Just give me a second. Then,
Record,
oh,
are you recording?
yes, it's already recording. Yes, it should still be going. So if we do all those things, then the incinerator can turn around. Now, it is owned by the county, so the county would probably be the one doing this, but the incinerator operator, they're the ones that get paid regardless. But the county could say, well, we're short on waste this year. Why don't we start asking for waste from other counties to fill that up? And so that's what happens. And what happens with your municipalities, if they're contracting with this situation, is that they're on the hook. So they're paying to do the right thing, like, or paying to recycle and compost. And then we have to pay the incinerator to not use them a certain amount. So you're paying twice, but the incinerator company, they get paid twice for the same capacity because they get paid for the waste that you're not sending them, plus any waste they get that waste from somewhere else, they get paid twice now for that same capacity. It's a great deal for incinerator companies, terrible deal for our health and environment and those of us who live in these communities. So they compete with zero waste solutions. They also compete with clean energy alternatives in a lot of cases where you have policies that mix that up. Not so much in Florida, but they do call it renewable energy here, but in your waste policy. In a lot of states, they have renewable energy mandates that if you end up with one in Florida at some point, they'll probably do like they do in my state, say that, oh, that's renewable or alternative energy. And therefore the mandates to buy wind and solar from utilities, once you have one of those eventually, maybe your politics will head that direction, then they're going to say, okay, well, that wind and solar, amount that your utilities are having to invest in also includes burning trash. So they're going to go from coal and gas, mostly gas here, but trash incinerators being dirtier than coal, they're going to go to something even dirtier than fossil fuels and say that's renewable energy, and they're going to charge you for that. So that happens in a lot of states. We also see a trend where these facilities, to monetize themselves, they seek out more dangerous waste streams like medical waste, like drugs and guns and stuff that police collect, pharmaceuticals, like any type of industrial waste stream that they can get, that is worth a lot more per ton. And so they seek that out, and that makes it more dangerous for your community. Okay, so I mentioned a few times it's worse than coal. This is just some of the data on that, showing how much worse than coal it is for different pollutants. This is EPA data and showing the ratios of it. So we crunched all the numbers from all the plants around the country several years ago, and we see that for a lot of the pollutants, it's much worse. There's some that they're less bad on, like sulfur dioxide, but most of them, they're the worst. But the real comparison is not to other energy sources. It's incinerators versus landfills, or actually landfills versus both, because with an incinerator, you still have a landfill for the ash. Yeah, we'll get there in a second. So in order to analyze this, we use what's called life cycle assessments. So there are studies that have been done. A lot of them just look at climate as if we only care about the global climate change issues, which we do, but we also care about asthma and cancer and other things that affect the community more directly, health like heart attacks and stuff that happen from particulate matter. All those pollutants add up. And so the MEBCalc model, the last one there, that is the most comprehensive one. And most of the studies out there just look at climate. We made sure to look at all of it. And there are two places where these have been applied in recent years that I have slides for you. One of them is one I did in Montgomery County, Maryland, where the county executive, not trusting some of their consultants that were told to talk about the benefits of incineration, not the harms, in the scope of work of their own studies and consulting for the county. And so the county executive said, all right, well, can you give us the other side of the story? You know, tell us what our consultants aren't telling us, because they were told not to tell us that anyway. And so we used this model and we looked at it and we found that trash incineration is 3.2 times more harmful for climate, health, and environment than going straight to the landfill. So this first bar is the incinerator. The blue part is the climate. It's about twice as bad than going to a landfill. And a lot of people and a lot of politicians very confused about this, thinking, oh, landfills have methane, and methane is really bad for the climate. It's 82 times worse than CO2 over 20 years, which is true. And we accounted for that. We actually used some older data at the time, said it was 86 times worse, now understood to be closer to 80. But the worst case scenario for that, and it still shows that burning the trash and putting all that carbon directly into the atmosphere is that much worse than putting it into a landfill, even though you have methane, even though a lot of it is going to leak out. And on top of that, you've got in brown, you've got the heart attacks and strokes associated with the particulate matter. In yellow, you've got the asthma attacks associated with the nitrogen oxides that trigger asthma. In red, you've got the birth defects and cancers associated with toxic chemicals and carcinogens that are coming out. And then layered on top, you got a number of other impacts. And similar results to this have been found in several other studies. This second chart is from the same study, and this really gets at the issue of transportation. One of the common misconceptions that you will hear from your public works directors, from your politicians, is, oh, well, it would be much worse if we had to truck it far away to a landfill. Actually, you don't even have to. Maybe they don't say that much here because you have your own landfills. But should they fill up and not get replaced in the area, they'll be like, oh, if we don't have an incinerator, we'll have to truck it up to Central Florida or something. Well, that is a very common argument we hear around the country, especially in places like Southeast Florida, where they do have to travel a lot more to get to other landfills. And what we found in this study, in red, you see the incinerator. In yellow, you see the 10 different landfills that we evaluated. And some of those landfills have rail access. So you see that in black at the top, and the rest of them is just by truck in blue. The transportation element is that tiny little cap on top of these bars. This is just the climate impacts, but other measures, they look similar in the charts. You would literally have to drive a diesel truck that everyone's fretting about, saying, oh, the trucks are the problem. You would have to drive one of those diesel trucks from Montgomery County, Maryland to California to reach a landfill to almost catch up to being as bad as using the incinerator in their own county. It is not about transportation. It was never about the trucks. And even the consultants that are pro-incinerator that cook the books on every other thing, even one of those studies, if you look at the part about the transportation part of it, it says the same thing. It proves our point. It's not about transportation. So in Delaware County, Pennsylvania is the other major study. This one is the whole methodology spelled out as a 48-page report. If you want to, if you have trouble sleeping, it's good reading. It's very dense. I apologize, but and I didn't write it, but I did help summarize it. I'm the kind of the translator between the PhD economists who made this model and people actually understanding it in charts like this. So this is a similar chart to the first one I showed you from Delaware County, Pennsylvania, using that model. And it found instead of 3.2 times, it was 2.3 times worse to use the incinerator. But you see the same basic effect. And in that middle bar, usually you only see that middle bar. Actually see a more manipulated version of that. But the difference between the first two, which are both the incinerator, the first one is the community impacts, like the complete everything impact. But the second one is after you account for offsets. And so usually you don't even get to see the first one, because these studies will say, well, they make electricity, and so they're not burning fossil fuel somewhere. So we're going to subtract from that. And they're recycling some metals out of the ash that don't burn. And so they're not having to mine metal somewhere else. So we're going to give them some more subtraction points for that. And then all you see is the subtracted version. You see versions that actually subtract most of the blue part, the climate part, because they cut over half of that out. and say, oh, that carbon doesn't count because, it came from burning food scraps and yard waste and paper, and, trees regrow. So, it's all kind of the same. And in reality, CO2 in a tree is not heating the atmosphere, but in the air it is. But they kind of go with outdated climate science and say, okay, we can erase most of those emissions. And that's how they get away with saying, oh, we're better than landfills, we're better than fossil fuels, we're actually great for the climate. Well, even though they're the worst thing for the climate, they are very good at manipulating the data. But what you're seeing here is most of the impacts from the last bar, which is the landfill, are the climate impacts. If we compost, if we get the food scraps from events like this and everywhere, you're cooking at home, and put them into composting buckets instead of trash cans, then your landfills are not going to be gassy and stinky like that, having all those greenhouse gas impacts. Your emissions will go down to almost nothing if you get that stuff out of there. So let me stick with this for a second. Let me point out that this model is economists came up with it. It's a way of putting all these things in dollar amounts. So you can put them all on one chart so that decision makers can see this kind of comparison. So it's kind of weird because in a way they're saying, well, your heart attack is worth this many dollars, and your cancer is worth this many, your asthma attack is worth this much. That's what economists do. And it's not necessarily good and right, but that's the way you can do this kind of study. They also have this thing called the social cost of carbon. So 1 ton of carbon dioxide is equal to, $2,000 or whatever the figure is for this year. And so that's how these studies are able to put this together into one thing where you have apples and oranges, they monetize them. So what you're seeing here is dollars per ton of waste. So you're paying, and does anyone know what you pay? Like, not you, but like the companies in your towns, what is paid per ton to dispose of trash at the incinerator? Marsha, do you know? Okay, we'll find out. But usually you're looking at something between $50 and $100 per ton. Some places are lower, some places a little higher, depends on where you are in the country. But on top of that, in this case, they're paying 80. Now it's going to be about $100 a ton in Delaware County, Pennsylvania. But on top of that, we're looking at $337 per ton of health and environmental damage that's externalized, that we pay in our medical bills, that we pay as a society in terms of damage from hurricanes and that sort of thing. So that's what this number means. Now that's per ton. So now that we're going this next chart, this one is not per ton. This is the whole system. So this is saying in Delaware County, Pennsylvania, it is $104 million. This is back in 2020, $104 million per year in harm to health and environment from the current system that uses the largest trash incinerator in the country. And if they adopted a zero waste plan, which was just approved by the county council just last month unanimously, I worked on this for the past 4 years, developing this plan. And this plan, it's a zero waste plan, which means no incineration is allowed in a zero waste plan. So that means switching to using their landfill and reducing waste, reduce, reuse, recycle, compost as much as they can. So that would cause an 85% reduction in harm per year if they actually implement that. Now, to show the power of the alternative, the zero waste solutions, what we're already seeing in 2020 with the amount that people are already doing in recycling and maybe some bits of reuse and a little bit of composting here or there is close to $400 million in harm that's already being avoided. That's not happening because people are doing the right thing. If we implement the zero waste plan, that more than doubles. So very potent impacts if we actually do the right things in terms of zero waste. Now, last chart before I stop bewildering you with all these crazy life cycle analysis charts. This one, I didn't pick the colors for this, or I would have made them standard. So the blue on the previous ones is climate, that's black now in this chart. So on the last bar, the tallest one, that is the incinerator. The first 3 are the same landfill that you just saw a couple slides ago. And it's looking at it under 3 different scenarios. One is if they capture 70% of their gas. One is if they capture 30% of their gas. And the tallest of them, the one that's almost as bad as the incinerator, if they capture none of their gas and it's just leaking out like crazy everywhere. Now, we don't have landfills that are doing that anymore for the most part. Any modern landfill is required of any significant size is required to be collecting its landfill gas, and usually they burn it one way or another. Not that those are all good ways, but it's better than leaks everywhere. So we don't have this scenario where it's this bad for a landfill. But what this is showing is that even if we did have the worst case scenario landfill, it is not as bad as having an incinerator. The gray part is all the other impacts that are not climate added together. Now, the point on transport, there are two lessons from this slide. One is that, basically landfills cannot be as bad as incinerators, but generally for climate, they're in this somewhere between the 30 and 70%. They usually say 75% gas capture, but they're probably being optimistic. So it's probably between 30 and 70%. So one of these two bars is the reality for landfills versus incinerators being the tall bar. But the other lesson here is repeating the earlier lesson about transportation. The red caps, those are the trash trucks that go to your house. They're still going to your house no matter what. So that's the same on all of these. That's just the transportation part from the collection trucks. The yellow part, which you can barely see, I'll see in a second. The yellow part, that's a thin sliver on this tall one. That is the trucks going from the transfer stations in that county, it's a small county, to their incinerator nearby. And then the ash trucks going a couple counties away to dump the ash in another landfill. The thicker yellow lines in the first three is if they sent all the trash all the way two counties away to the landfill. So this whole debate over, oh, those dirty diesel trucks, you wouldn't want to send them 2 counties away to reach a landfill because the trucking emissions matter. This yellow line, that debate between that sliver and this slightly thicker sliver, that's what they're debating. All right, so please, if anyone says, oh, the trucks, just be like, please, look at some of the data on this because you don't know what you're talking about. Okay, I see a hand back there. Yes, do you have a question?
She was saying, what if we could find a way we don't have to use trash cans?
Awesome. That's literal zero waste, which we don't expect to get to literally, but we can make it really small and we'll talk about that. I'll share some more stuff on that a little later. Okay, so first I want to go through the air emissions issues with this, because there's a lot of mythology, a lot of stuff. If you ever tour the incinerator or hear from the incinerator company, they're going to say a lot of things. And I want you to be armed with information to be able to fight back when they're lying to you or misleading things, because they do that a lot. They say what I call the smokestack story. They say, don't worry, we have continuous emissions monitors on our smokestack, and we know what's coming out at all times. And that data goes to the state, and they're very rigorous enforcers. So if we went over a limit or something, they'd hit us really hard. And the limits that we're staying within mean that's healthy and safe. Has anyone heard any version of that? See a few hands, okay? So you've heard this. This is everywhere, same kind of story. So I want to kind of show where the emperor is not wearing clothes in this example. I have 7 points to make on this. First of all, they're not always within their permit limits. They do violate them from time to time, sometimes fairly frequently, depending on the incinerator. And fines are not enough to change behavior. One of the 5 near me has been having routine malfunctions for the past roughly 7 years and been operating illegally in doing so. And they did get busted one big time by the state a couple of years ago. And they were fined, I think it was $200,000 or $300,000. And that was a big record fine for our state. And that turned out to be about 2 to 3 days worth of tipping fee revenues for the company. It was like a mosquito bite to them. It's the cost of doing business. They have continued to have the same problems on a regular basis since that fine. It has not changed the reality of what's going on at that plant. They also cannot meet modern limits, at least for nitrogen oxides. And so if this plant were built today, not even counting the new regulations that are supposedly coming in December, if they built it today and operated the way they did, it would be illegal. They would not be allowed to release that much nitrogen oxide, triggering asthma attacks in your community. If it got a permit any point in the past decade, it would not be allowed to do that. And our limits are weaker than other countries. It's weaker than it's supposed to be in this country. Every 5 years, they're supposed to update these regulations for this industry. And they have not, we're still operating on 2006 regulations. So they should have been updated by 2011. It took a federal lawsuit against EPA to get a federal court to rule that they have to come out with these new rules already. And they were supposed to be out December of last year under Biden. And they did come out with a draft. And that draft, they picked the weakest of 3 options for 8 of the 9 pollutants. and the middle one for nitrogen oxides. And so that was under a Democratic administration that everyone thinks is like so great for the environment. They picked some of the weakest options they could. And then that decision got punted another year into the Trump administration. So now it's supposed to be this December, we're supposed to see new regulations that would still take a few more years to come into effect. So we'd be looking at over 20 years instead of 5 years of getting updated regulations of this industry. We also know, yes, go
The
ahead.
people writing those regulations have been, furloughed, they're not being paid, they're not working,
Right.
so they're not working.
Yeah, good point. That is probably not going to come out December for that reason alone. So we also know that the permit limits are not based on health and safety. In one case in Pennsylvania, when I was speaking at a public hearing, they were trying to build an ethanol biorefinery about 8 miles away from another one of the same size using a different fuel. And I noticed that in the permits for these two that were being permitted at the same time, they had limits that were 6 times different in one of the permits. And so I said, people are being told here that these limits mean healthy and safe. If that's true, how come healthy and safe is 6 times different 8 miles away? They couldn't get out of that question. And we have them on video admitting in a public hearing that has nothing to do with health and safety. It's a technology-based standard. If they pick they're going to use this fuel versus this other fuel, then that determines where the limit gets put. It's not based on there's a certain amount of pollution that would make people get cancer, asthma, heart attacks, etc. Therefore, you can't cross this line. That's not how it works anywhere in the country. That's not our regulatory system. So get that out of your head if they're trying to say, oh, we're below that line. Well, yeah, that line should have been much lower 20 years ago already, but that's what they argue. We also know that's not based on health and safety because the permit limits are concentration based. And so if you have a 500 ton, how many tons per day is this one?
I'm not sure, Mike, we'll look at that. tomorrow.
Okay. I think it's somewhere in like probably 1,500 to 2,000 maybe, probably 1,500-ish. So if you had a 500 ton per day trash incinerator, it would be allowed to put out a certain amount, right? But you have a 1,500 ton per day trash incinerator, it's allowed now to put out 3 times as much because they burn more trash. That's how the permits are written because everything is in parts per million, nanograms per dry standard cubic meter. It's always per something. So if you have more going through, more pollutants are allowed to come out. That is how the regulations and the permits are written. So it's not like some crazy conspiracy or something. That's the system design. That is how it's supposed to be. Not how it should be, but that's what it's meant to do. There's also no safe dose of a lot of the chemicals that they are allowing in these permits to go into your air. Oh, is that happening? All right.
Good.
It's fine? Okay,
Yeah.
cool. So a number of the things, lead, mercury, dioxins, radiation, particulate matter, a lot of the pollutants, PFAS, there's no safe dose of these chemicals. So even though they say this is the amount that's allowed in a permit, that does not mean it's healthy and safe for your community. We also know that this company, now called Ewall, but they were Cavanta a couple years ago, they have been caught rigging their stack tests in some cases, or even rigging their continuous monitors. So you can't trust the data coming out from this company. And the real place where the emperor wears no clothes, though. If you ever tour their plant, you'll see a control room. They'll have a lot of monitors, kind of feels like a NASA control room, and you see bells and whistles going off. You think, oh, they really know what they're doing. They're on top of all these things, right? A lot of data coming in. Well, the reality is that when they tell you, oh, we have continuous monitors, we know what's coming out of our stack. If you really want to undress the emperor, just ask one question. Which pollutants are you continuously monitoring? Then you find out that there are only 3. And that the rest of them, they don't know what's coming out day to day. They know once a year at best for most of them. So what I equate this to is that if we regulated motorists for speeding the same way we regulate most chemicals from smokestacks in this country, we would let people drive around all year with no speedometer in their car. And once a year on the highway, there will be a speed trap set and there will be warning signs saying, warning, slow down, speed trap ahead. And then the brother of the driver would be running the speed trap because they hire their own consultants to do the tests. That is literally how things are happening right now. And the three pollutants that they do continuously monitor are none of the toxic ones. They're carbon monoxide, nitrogen oxides that trigger asthma attacks, and sulfur oxides that cause acid rain and other respiratory problems. And they do some other things that are parameters. They monitor oxygen and temperature continuously. So they like to make a big long list, you know, so it makes it more than 3. So they things that aren't pollutants, they're like, well, we continuously monitor those too. But the reality is that the technology exists for over 50 things to be continuously monitored, and they're not being required to do this because we don't have state and local governments outside of Oregon and some local governments I've worked in the Mid-Atlantic to pass laws that up the ante and say, okay, we want to use modern technology and actually know what's be going into our air because we should have a right to know this stuff. The biggest one in the country, one of the 5 near me in Chester, Pennsylvania, is the only one I could find in the whole nation that has data for hydrochloric acid that's from continuous monitoring as well as once-a-year stack tests like we usually have at plants like this here. And what I found after looking at their 6 burners across about 6 or 7 years is that on average, the amount actually coming out is 62% worse than the once-a-year stack test tells us. Which means if that's true generally, then what you're getting is just the one that's the underestimated number. You don't know what that bigger number really is. Even though they're already #1 in hydrochloric acid emissions in your county, they're probably more than, well, it can't be more than #1, but they're a bigger #1 if you knew what the real data was. Dioxins, the most toxic chemicals known to science, they are even more extreme. They're very temperature sensitive. So when it starts up, shuts down, has malfunctions, when they're not allowed to do the test once a year, they only do that under ideal operating conditions, they spike this pollutant. And so in Europe, where they do use continuous monitoring technology, continuous sampling to be technical about it, they can collect a sample for up to a month and send it off to a lab and say, what was it like that month? Well, in multiple studies, they found in one case about 30 to 50 times higher emissions, not percent now, we're talking times higher than what we think they are in the US. In another case, 460 to almost 1,300 times higher dioxin emissions than what we're told we're getting when we get that once-a-year best behavior test. So this is from the Palm Beach County, the new incinerator, but it's going to be similar to what you have here and any incinerator around the country. The green are the pollutants that they have to continuously monitor. The yellow are the once a year. The orange is the once every however many years you have burners. So at this plant, you have 3 burners for dioxins. They'll test once this year. They test burner 1 this year, burner 2 next year, burner 3 the next year, and then they'll go back to burner 1. So you don't even get each burner being tested each year for the most toxic chemicals known to science. And then the red ones, they don't test at all. That is what's actually happening. This is inexcusable. This is something that laws at the state and local level could be passed to say, why don't we make this whole column green and give us some real data on what we're breathing, and then we can have a conversation. And this company's going to run away screaming and say, oh, we're going to shut our plant down instead. Good. If they're that scared of the truth, then let that happen. Okay, so let's talk about dioxins a little bit more for a minute. They are the most toxic group of chemicals known to science, literally 140,000 times more toxic than mercury, for which there's also no safe dose. If I listed all the health effects that caused, you would not be able to read the print on this slide, but it's all kinds of things. Cancer is not even as much of what's known for as its non-cancer effects on like birth outcomes, birth defects, endometriosis, sexual reproductive disorders, immune system problems, all kinds of things. And 93% of our exposure to this chemical is not from breathing the air nearby. It is from eating cheeseburgers and anything else that has meat or dairy in it. Or eggs. Because it is fat soluble and it climbs up the food chain so effectively that it would take you 14 years standing in a farm field next to a grazing cow. Not that we let cows do that anymore, but let's pretend. So if that cow is grazing, eating the grass, it's going to take it 14 years to put as much dioxin in its body from the dioxin that just settles on the grass. It's not water soluble, so it doesn't go into the plant, it just sits on it. And that cow is going to take 1 day to put as much dioxin in its body. Then you'll be able to, like, you'll take 14 years of breathing the air but that cow in one day will ingest that much dioxin. And then if you eat that cow or drink its milk or its cheese or ice cream or whatever else, or omelet, thank you. So basically, if you're not vegan, you're getting exposed to a lot. This is a chart from EPA. I did not make this up. This is EPA's chart on where you get your dioxin from. And number one source, beef, then dairy and milk. I was vegetarian by the time I saw this. This got me go all the way vegan because I was like, you kidding me? Like dairy and milk combined are the largest source of the most toxic stuff there is. And here I am fighting it and I'm eating it on purpose. So I took a while, but I stopped. And you'll see it's all meat and dairy down to eggs. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 main categories. And then inhalation, then soil ingestions, like mostly with kids, hand to mouth activity. And water is negligible because they actually say it's hydrophobic and lipophilic. It hates water and loves fat. That's what this chemical does. Similar to mercury, but mercury comes out and it's not like that yet until it hits the water body. And then microbes get to it and makes it methylmercury, and then it likes fat, and then it climbs up the food chain in the fish. That's why when you hear about mercury, it's like fish consumption advisories. Don't eat the fish, especially in Florida. But every county, almost every water body, there are like 2,000 some advisories of don't eat the fish in Florida. And it's almost all because of mercury. Actually, ironically, 98.6% of those 2,000 some advisories in Florida are because of mercury. So I thought that was cute, but that's the real number. So dioxin is one of the other things that you'll see fish consumption advisories for. But since dioxin comes out of the stack already fat soluble, it doesn't need to hit a water body and get converted. It gets in your cows, your chickens, your pigs, everything, your kids. If a woman is pregnant, well, let me start with men. If men get dioxin in them, well, when we do, we all do, we cannot get it out of our bodies. There's a 7.5-year half-life. So if I stopped eating and doing anything as if I was dead, then in 7.5 years, I would have half of the dioxin that I started with. But since we do eat things, it's just, it accumulates. Women, though, have 2 ways of getting it out of their bodies. And they both involve having a baby. One is that crosses the placenta. The other is that comes out in the breast milk. So infants get the highest dose of anyone. It's about, I think, 12% or so of our lifetime dose of dioxin comes in infancy. And so unless that woman has been like vegan most of her life, she will pass on that toxic burden to her child. That's just the biology of those. Okay, so I know it's really depressing, sorry. It'll get better, I promise. So, all right, incinerator ash, we're gonna do a little bit on that, and I think it won't be too long until we'll be talking about zero waste and we can all be happy on that. So this is a picture of the ash landfill in Palm Beach County. You have landfills around here that are receiving the ash from the burning of your trash in Buckingham. It won't look too different from this. And that ash can blow off of the top of the landfills. They use the ash as cover material for itself. So instead of covering with soil or tarp at the end of the day so it doesn't blow away, they cover it with itself, which defeats the whole point of daily cover at landfills. Yes. Marshall would know. Is that where it is? You want to tell him? Are you talking about the Zemel Road one? Yes. Yes, that's right. Absolutely. Yes. Thank you for knowing that. So we are not fans of landfills. However, we recognize that landfills are the lesser evil compared to incinerators with ash landfills, which means that for a time, they will actually get bigger until we get our Zero Waste Act in order and reduce the size of the landfills. But bigger is not as dangerous as smaller and more toxic. And that's the big distinction between what kind of landfill do we want? Do we want one that has ash in it or unburned trash? And can we reduce that trash to the point where it doesn't have to be the big mountain that you're not used to seeing in Florida? Okay, so to your point, Marcia, earlier, how much ash are we talking about? For every 100 tons of trash you burn, you get about 30 tons of ash. That's by weight. Now, the industry likes to argue volume. So they say, oh, it's a 90% reduction. So if you hear that, both are correct. It's just they're picking the numbers that work better for them. But we pay by the ton, we haul by the ton. So it's not unreasonable to talk about it in terms of tons. But in terms of landfill space, yes, it's by volume. So either way, there's still a lot of ash left over. And the reason I have coffee beans on here if you took coffee beans and poured water over it, you're not gonna get coffee, right? But if you grind them up and increase the surface area, now you get coffee. It's the same principle with trash versus ash. If I take this cell phone and I chuck it into a landfill, it's gonna take a really long time for the toxic metals and the brominated flame retardants and other stuff in here to get into my body in a way I can eat, breathe, or drink, right? But if you burn this instantly for not cell phones, but for trash in general, 70% of it is now going up into the smokestack, out into the air, and 30% of it is now ash. That's small particles. And so those pieces, those metals and other things in there that are toxic and dangerous are now made more toxic because the dioxins get formed in the combustion process. So those aren't already in there. So the things that are already in here, plus things that were created in the combustion process, are now in that ash and are now little particles that can blow off of the truck on the way to the landfill, that can blow off the top of the landfill when they use the ash as daily cover for itself. And when rainwater hits that landfill, it can leach those contaminants into the groundwater once your landfill liner eventually starts ripping and failing. So we pushed back on this narrative that ash is non-toxic. What happens is they have to test this ash. I think it's quarterly, but some places, this company's decided they're going to do it annually and break the law. And they got in trouble for that some places. But they test and use a test that EPA says is the one to use. Now, they used to have a different test. This is like back in the early 90s. And the test would come up saying that the fly ash, that's the small particles that are caught in the pollution controls. That's the really toxic stuff. That would fail the test about 90% of the time. The bottom ash about 40%. But what they do is they change the test. Once a lawsuit happened, the EPA used to say, well, ash is special waste. We're going to categorically say that it's not hazardous, just by definition, because we can. And a lawsuit brought to the US Supreme Court out of Chicago. This US Supreme Court at the time, in 1994, said, if a test hazardous, it's hazardous. So EPA changed the test and made sure that it never comes up hazardous. And they chemically manipulate it so that you can now combine the fly ash and bottom ash, dilute it in the course of that, add certain chemicals that help it pass the short-term lab test and do it under pH where they know things don't leach out. And then, gee, it's not hazardous. And then they twist that language of legally non-hazardous and have county agencies like yours and companies like this one operating the one here tell you that means it's inert and non-toxic, which is not what that means. It's not what legally non-hazardous means. It can still be toxic and dangerous, but it just means it's not at a certain level that they're going to regulate a certain way. And so they are misusing language to make people think that non-hazardous means safe and you can put this on your breakfast cereal or something. Like, that's not the kind of stuff we're talking about. And we actually got last year, less than a year ago, last December, we got EPA. We've been pushing them on a number of fronts, and one of them is on this ash issue. And the big progress we got on this is just this frequently asked question number 6. So we're far from what we want, but we got them to put this on their website, and it admits that this test is only testing what leaches into groundwater or leaches out of the ash. It's not even testing what's in the ash. It's saying what is going to come out of the ash if we put this acid on it for so many hours, under this lab condition. And this is emitting, the underlying part that I underscored, is that it does not address what happens if you breathe it. What happens if it blew off of a truck? What happens if it blew off of the landfill? What if you ingest this stuff? The test isn't even designed for that. It's not even covering that. So it can hurt you, but the test is saying, well, only if we assume that the only way you can get hurt is if this leaches out of the landfill into your groundwater eventually, and you drink that water or something. It's like, that's not what's happening. I mean, some of that is happening, but that's not the main route of exposure. And so the tests are not really dealing with the reality of what's going on with this stuff. And we at least got them to start admitting that that is what's happening.
So Mike is being modest here because it was really his work with Pierre that finally got the EPA to admit that this ash cannot be considered non-hazardous and that we have a right to know about this and a right to participate. So don't be so modest, Mike.
We're making little bits of progress with EPA. There are a few other ways, but one of the things that we're pushing back on this with is that they've been trying to use ash as something they can build roads with. Because they don't even want to have to pay to put it in a landfill. If they could give it away or sell it, I'm not sure which way the money goes, but if they can give it to an asphalt company and start building roads with this stuff, and then on the road, when it erodes over time, you get those little pieces of dioxin and mercury and stuff in your waterways and your air. That is what they want to do. And they've tried to do that here. They've tried to do it in Palm Beach County. They're doing it in my home county, where I grew up outside of Philadelphia. They're trying to do it in Hawaii and other places now. But every place that they've tried, they've failed so far. But they don't talk that way. So in Palm Beach County, there's like, oh, we tried it, it was really successful, but we're still trying to get the Department of Transportation to give us a thumbs up on it. And so like, I don't know what the holdup is there because they've been pushing for years. But this is from Hawaii, where we pushed this past year against it, and they're moving forward with it there, same company that you have here. And it's very dangerous to take this, what should be considered hazardous waste, even though they've designed a test to make sure it doesn't say that, and start deregulating it and using it where workers busting up roads or building the roads in the first place are going to get exposed, where everyone ultimately will have some exposure. All right, moving on. Trash incineration is one of the worst industries we've seen in terms of environmental racism. This is a trend in a lot of industries, but in this industry, it is more pronounced, especially in Florida. What we see, if we look at the most recent data, so there are 62 incinerators left in the country now, and 63% of them are in majority white communities. So you might be like, why are you talking about environmental racism? And then what's the problem? Well, the problem is that the bigger ones that we have are largely in communities of color. 14 of the 20 largest ones are in communities of color, mostly Black communities and Latino communities in some cases. In general, this industry, Black people are the most disproportionately impacted. And this is even though we have all these ones in white communities, if you adjust for the density of population, like how many people, because a lot of the ones in white communities are in rural communities, and a lot of the ones in Black communities are much more densely populated. So that skews the whole industry. And what you see as an entire industry is that mostly it's disproportionately impacting Black and brown people, especially Black people. But in Florida, it's Black and brown, a lot of Latino communities being impacted in the state, including right here. And the proposed new ones that they're trying to build in the state are fitting the same trend from what we're seeing. And the trash incinerators that are in communities of color are surrounded by 2.5 times as many people and are twice as large as the ones in white communities. And so that's why this whole industry has a racist trend, even though on the surface, if we're just counting them, we come back, well, most of them are in majority white communities, but you have to have some nuance. You have to recognize the size of them and the urbanity and how and who is impacted. This is from one of our websites. We have ejmap.org. If you do /justice, you'll get the one that's just race and class census data. And so if you look at the 2-mile radius around where the incinerator is in Buckingham, it's about 2/3 people of color living in that area. And so this fits that trend that I'm talking about. Okay, now you can take a deep breath. We're going to talk about zero waste now. All the bad stuff is behind us. So zero waste is defined internationally to basically be a visionary way of looking at, where we're going with waste management if we're doing the best thing we can. And I actually helped develop this definition. There's a redefinition. It used to be 3 paragraphs. So, let's make it 1 sentence. So this is in 2018. And you'll notice in there it says without burning. That is a priority for zero waste in recognition of the science that shows incineration to be that much worse than landfilling. It wasn't okay to say without burning or burying, because it's not on the same playing field. We do want to move away from both, but we need to prioritize moving away from the one that's clearly doing far more harm. And that's why the without burning is in there, but the without landfilling is somewhat de-emphasized because of the need to stop burning. And this is also reflected in the zero waste hierarchy, which is something I developed that then was adopted by the city of Oakland and then ultimately by the Zero Waste International Alliance to develop the standard for what zero waste means. And you'll see that incineration is under unacceptable at the bottom in that red triangle. The backstop is landfilling, but we don't want your grandfather's landfill or your actual current landfill. We want them done in a much better way. And so if we do the right things, you all know the 3 R's, right? I'm going to hide this from you for a second. What are the 3 R's? Okay, most of you got them in the right order. Let's get them in the right order again. Good. So they're in priority order for a reason. Because reduce is better than reuse is better than recycle. And everyone likes to start everything with an R. So rethink and redesign are the top. And then you got your reduce, reuse, recycle. You got your compost in there, which some people desperate to make everything start with RE, call it re-earth, but or rot, but still. So we all understand that. I don't have to explain what that means to you, but the orange, yellow and orange parts are a little less known. So let's talk about those for a second. Material recovery. This is where after you source, separate, and do all the good things up in the higher, more important parts of the hierarchy, you have machines that and people that can take those extra recyclables out, the cans that ended up in the trash can by accident, and get them pulled out. That's material recovery. Biological treatment, which is one of those, they only had so many colors to put in this. I would have made a separate step, but biological treatment is lumped in together with stabilized landfilling in the orange sector here. So residuals management, biological treatment is the part where what's left in there, a lot of it is organic material. It's stuff that should have hit the compost bin, but didn't. And so those orange peels and food scraps and yard waste and anything like that, that is something that you want to make sure is not going to get gassy and stinky in a landfill. So to do that, you can use what's called a biological stabilization or biological treatment process, which typically looks like an anaerobic digester. This is essentially composting, but in a vessel. So you make methane out of it. You get the methane generating potential out of it. And then you're reducing the volume, you're reducing the weight of it. You have less to ship to a landfill and it'll take up less space and not be so gassy and stinky because you got that gassiness out in a system where you can capture it much better than you can in an open air landfill with a bunch of pipes. So that's like the holy grail of a zero waste system if we did that on the back end. The problem with this, with what we call the MR, material recovery, and BT, biological treatment to landfill, is that it costs a lot. Maybe not as much as an incinerator, but it still costs. And we have public officials who are very lazy. And a lot of those same public officials, they will point to your communities and say, those people are lazy and won't recycle. And usually, especially if they're saying those people, there's some racist and classist stuff going on there. And we hear this a lot from city public works directors, and they say the same kind of stuff all over. And we point back at them, especially after doing studies like in Baltimore, where they were charging, they gave away large green trash bins and then charged people for small yellow recycle bins. It was like the wrong size, color, and cost. And so we did a program where we gave out recycle bins to people, gave them the education they needed on it, gave them the bins they needed, and gave them an economic incentive. We actually hired local people as block captains. They would weigh the trash bins and then they would weigh the trash and recycle bins once they had both, and like we would show the increase. And gee, those people that they were saying, oh, they're lazy and they won't do it. Well, gee, what their recycling went way up. So the lazy people are your public works directors. They are the ones that you have to point back to and say, who's the lazy one here? Because you didn't put the right incentive policies in, you didn't give people the right tools, you didn't give them the education. And so maybe that's the problem. And we have a lot of lazy public works directors who just are in the 1980s in terms of trash management and think that trash to steam is what's happening and that we're just making trash turning to good things magically. So we need to educate them, or more realistically, replace them with people who think like the year that we're in and actually put the right programs in place. So I'm going to show a contrast here and then we'll get into what those programs look like. So we got the zero waste hierarchy, which you'll see that incineration is unacceptable, is below landfilling. But with EPA, it's the opposite. This is what's guiding our public policy right now. This hierarchy, which is not a zero waste hierarchy, it's just their waste management hierarchy. They say that energy recovery means incineration, even though it's actually destroying a lot of embodied energy. So if you took the same things you throw in an incinerator and recycle or compost them, you save 3 to 5 times more energy. But we're going to call it energy recovery anyway, and make a tiny bit of energy and like make that sound better than landfills, which they call disposal. Well, incineration is also a form of disposal, but They pretend that disposal just means landfill and that energy recovery means incineration. And therefore incineration is better. And state governments, county and city governments, consultants, they all point to this framework and say EPA knows best. They must have science behind this or something. And when we challenged them 3 years ago, almost 4 years ago, we were talking to the top staff at their Office of Land and Emergency Management. And we pushed them on this and a few other things, including the ash. And we said, this is a problem. This hierarchy is causing local governments to push incinerators. And we know incinerators are worse, but the EPA thinks they're better still. And they admitted to us that they have zero documentation to back up the placement of incineration above landfilling in this hierarchy. And I was like, great, well, how about you get rid of this symbol then, or at least put them together in that last part of the triangle? And they said, well, we don't want to change our triangle yet, but we'll put a disclaimer on it. And so they did that. Since July 2022, there's a disclaimer everywhere you find this on EPA's website, not all the states and things that copy it, but you'll find on their website, there's a disclaimer that says EPA is in the process of reviewing this to determine if changes should be made based on the latest available data and information. They're taking a long time to do this. We're trying to get them to fix other broken models that they're going to use to then make this decision. So it's going to take some time, but there are bits of progress at EPA as far as that goes. Okay, and did the science sheet go around everywhere before some people escape? Okay, yeah, make sure everyone gets it.
I know that, just as it makes its way around, we've got it moving around, there it goes.
Okay.
Okay.
All right, so let's get through these last slides. Okay, yep. All right, so,
Go back to the jobs,
okay. Yeah, so zero waste solutions produce a lot of jobs, a lot more than you'll get from landfills or incinerators, especially the reuse of things, but the recycling and composting also up to 5 to 10 times more jobs for the same amount of material. And moving towards zero waste is a two-track process. One is you need to end incineration because you can't do a zero waste program if you're stuck in economic contracts that say you have to pay us to use the incinerator. It's a barrier to getting to zero waste. So getting incineration out of there is a prerequisite really to making progress on reducing, reusing, recycling, composting, and all of that. And this is what it looks like. And you know,
With Lake County a bunch. And what we were hearing on the ground from the villages, we've all heard of the villages, right? Is those ladies up there are telling us they are recycling nothing in the villages. They are sending it all to the Lake County incinerator. So that can tell you how incinerators are de-incentivizing other means or other more responsible ways to manage waste.
thank you, Marcia. This one? Sure. So yeah, I always emphasize if you have incineration being considered or being used to focus on that before focusing on zero waste, not to think that you're going to take down an incinerator by reducing waste enough. It never works in time, very rarely. So both can happen in the same parallel. You know, you can work on zero waste, but you need to have a campaign that says, okay, let's move beyond incineration, because as this facility ages and gets more expensive, your county is likely to say, oh, we're going to build a new one or repair it or something of that nature. It's going to cost you a huge amount of money and get you into the same economic contracts that get you in trouble. And so focusing on that at the same time that, you know, other people or some of the same can be saying, okay, let's get composting going. That's fine, but don't lose the focus on the anti-incinerator part because they'll sabotage the other work if you don't. So in some of the places, a couple of these plans are ones that I was part of consulting teams on in Delaware County, Pennsylvania is the most recent. One in Montgomery County, Maryland, I worked on as well. And these are whole lengthy plans that some of them are like 40 pages up to 100 pages of just details on what you could do to reduce, reuse, recycle, compost waste, and in some cases to transition away from incineration, which some of these plans were designed to do because they have incinerators still. And some of the big building blocks of these systems. The first one has a lot of names, but it's usually called pay as you throw, which is also called save as you throw now and some other fun names. But what that means is you pay per bag or per bin. So right now, when we pay for electricity, for water, for gas, you pay for how much you use, right? But with trash, it's totally different. Your neighbor could put out 10 bags a week, you could put out one, you pay the same price, and it's not fair. So in these kinds of programs where over 10,000 communities are now using this around the country,
Gainesville.
there you go. You pay per bag or per bin, and what you find is instantly 44% reduction in the amount of waste generated per person. As soon as you make people start paying attention to how they're paying for that service. We also need to have mandatory recycling and composting, education, all the pieces that go with it. Composting, curbside collection, just everything should be as easy as it is to throw out trash. You should be able to compost and recycle just as easily wherever you live. And for construction and demolition waste, which is a big waste stream, instead of demolishing buildings, taking them apart carefully, create a lot more jobs doing that. This is a chart showing that with the pay-as-you-throw type of system, you see on average, this is a 43% reduction that you found in this example, and about 20% of that is people making less in the first place. They pay attention when they go to shop now and buy things that have less packaging. They bring more things to Goodwill instead of putting them in trash cans. So the reduce and reuse are even higher on the zero waste hierarchy, or both hierarchies actually. And so those priorities get met when you make people start paying attention to this. So this is the most effective and cost-effective way to quickly reduce waste, is to charge per bag or per bin. You just have to overcome your politicians' stubbornness when they say, oh, people are going to think it's a tax increase. Or no, they're just paying for it differently. You just have to roll it out correctly. And they say, oh, there's going to be illegal dumping. And then you have to debunk that and point out that no, that's like usually mattresses and tires and things that are stuff because you don't have a good bulk collection system, or because it's construction demolition waste that contractors are dumping. That's where most of that comes from. People don't radically change their habits and start dumping in the woods and stuff. That doesn't tend to happen with this. So once you overcome those kind of conceptual hurdles that your politicians have, you can get a sane policy that will cut 40% of your waste out like overnight. And the best example I have is this one here. You'll see different communities that did this. And the last one, Sanford, Maine. I didn't make these charts, so I apologize. That's not a zero axis. It starts at 40. But you can see that top part in that blue there, that's what they were generating per person before they adopted pay-as-you-throw. And they adopted it and it cut down by the typical amount, about 40% And then a guy there in that town didn't like it. He had just won the lottery and he campaigned against it. He put up billboards and got rid of it. And their waste generation jumped right back almost to where it was until a few years later when he moved out of town. And people were like, why don't we try that again? And they did, and it went right back down. These are the same people. And the way they pay for it over a span of just a few years will radically change how much waste they're generating. That's how effective this policy is. And on construction demolition waste, a lot of reports and even a book written about how we can reduce waste from construction and building materials. This is a big issue for Florida, considering how many hurricanes and things are destroying structures, and you have a lot of the same material becoming disaster debris. So it's like not just C&D anymore, it's construction, demolition, and disaster debris, CDD. And if we can find ways to recover a lot of that stuff, so we're not just reopening old landfills and filling them up with waste after every disaster, that would be much better. So I think we're basically at the end. This is just making a point on the zero waste hierarchy that there's a point at which you're hitting source separation, and then you're separating into reusables, recyclable, compostable, and waste. And the reusables, we usually kind of skip over that, but that's like 5%. Some estimate higher, but so the one data I've seen on this is about 5% of the waste stream, or I should say discard stream. It's not waste until you waste it, but it's 50% of the value in all that stuff. So the Goodwills, thrift stores, all the things that recover those materials, the apps that offer up, and other ones like FreeCycle, where you can like get other people to take things that you don't want anymore. That is a great important thing to be doing. So basically, we have three options on the back end. We can use a landfill directly. We can burn it first and make it worse. Or we can do the zero waste approach, have less waste, use digestion on the back end to process things so our landfill is not so gassy and sticky. So leave it, oh, okay, I'm lying for a few more slides. Zero waste to landfill is not zero waste. It's a code word for saying we're gonna burn everything and pretend we're not sending ash to a landfill, so just be savvy to that. And these are the players. So if you see, you're gonna see a lot of these names. Here you have Reworld, which used to be Cavanta. Those are the incinerator companies. Under that, you've got another layer. You've got the trade associations. So Waste to Energy Association is their latest name for the national one. They keep changing it. In Florida, you now have a statewide Waste to Energy Coalition that has these players in it. And then you got a layer of consultants. So you'll probably see your county contracting with Arcadis or some of these other consultants that are very popular here in Florida, that some of them are members, like Arcadis is a member of the Florida Waste to Energy Coalition, but they're consulting for governments as if they're neutral, objective, solid waste consultants. And then they come out with advice that says, do incinerators. So there are conflicts of interest here that need to be exposed. And then you've all heard like the idea of tobacco science, like, can someone let them in? We've got scientists out in New York City. That's the Global WTERT Council. They put out things like the Scientific Truth About Waste to Energy report, which will get promoted by your local governments. I've seen it a lot. To say, oh, these are academics out of New York universities that say incinerators are wonderful. Well, gee, they don't put this in the report. They don't say what program they're under, but that program is funded by the same people you see up here, GBB, Reworld, Waste Innovations. They're funded by the incinerator industry to come out with pro-incinerator information from an academic lens. And you even have nonprofits like Center for American Progress that put out a report saying incinerators are better than landfills for the climate. And gee, for the decade after they put out the report, Reworld, the company running your incinerator, funded them $50,000 to $100,000 a year for a decade. So, yeah. Okay.
And when you answer the questions, if you would just summarize it into the computer so that the folks at home on Zoom can hear the question you're gonna
Oh,
answer.
gotcha. Yep.
Yeah, Alicia?
We have 2 online. too.
Can you come back to the presentation?
Sure.
How do they do in Europe or in Japan, places where they don't have the luxury of having landfills? So what is the technology that they utilize?
They're using tons of incinerators. The geography of incinerators globally is basically Japan, Europe, and the Eastern US. Thank you. Take care. So Japan at one point had 3/4 of the world's incinerators. Now it's probably reducing, and China's now building tons of them. So, and even they're regretting it. They're building too many. And China's like, oops, we've overbuilt. And Europe is also starting to realize that they screwed up prioritizing incinerators. And they're starting to recognize the need to phase them out, shut them down, because it's not the climate solution they thought. And it's not a good waste management solution they thought. And some of them, now that they're doing a good amount of recycling, are like, oops, now we're finding ourselves having to import trash from other countries just to feed our things that we heat our buildings with, because they're doing that in Scandinavia, especially. So there are just a lot of problems with their addiction to incineration. We need to have zero waste systems. We need to do like that town in Japan does, where, I mean, one of them is really extreme, and they have like 90 categories or something to separate things out into. We don't have to necessarily go that far. It'd be good if we start with like 4 or 5. But zero waste is a set of programs. It's not engineering, it's social engineering. We need to figure out how to create the right incentives and structures for people to have the ease and ability to take the things that we collect with our 10 fingers and bring into our lives separately, and put them out of our lives separately and not together. That's the engineering.
For years, zero waste. And I teach electricity group, and I challenge my students to do zero waste for a week. And we all fail because we have medicine bottles, we have.
They're recyclable.
The economy.
And reusable.
The economy is based in a way that we don't have a circular economy. We have a linear economy where we take, make, and waste. This is how the world runs, unfortunately, more than 95% worldwide. Not only in the United States, we also are aware of plant obsolescence. So things are designed in a way that are going to last just a few years. because this is how the economy is moving on. Everybody knows that. I mean, so how, it's not only the government, it's not only us, it's how the economy is built. That we need to keep buying more stuff to move the economy forward.
Okay, let me try to summarize your,
Excuse me, there was a request that the questions.
I know, that's
Stated.
what I'm struggling with, because you just said a lot. So, what she was saying for the folks in the audience, online, is that she has students that have tried to do zero waste and they failed, and that the system is not designed for that. It's not circular, it's take, make, waste, economy. And so we need to change our system. That's basically what you said, right? So yes, we need to change our system. That's what this is about. This is not about individual behavior. There is an emphasis in our culture by the Ad Council, by Keep America Beautiful, by so many corporate funded entities to make this about individualism. And let me dive a little deeper into that. In 2015, I saw there was this young woman who made a mason jar's worth of trash in 2 years. And I know another guy in Tennessee who's fought incinerators. He makes 1 pound of trash a year. I was like, well, I wonder how good I am. I've never measured this. So in January, I had a Ziploc bag and I put all my stuff that I couldn't recycle, reduce, reuse, recycle, or compost into that Ziploc bag. I still have it from 10 years ago. And January's bag was like this big. And I was like, why is it this big? And I looked at it, it was almost all plastic film. And I bought toilet paper and one of those big things with plastic around it all. And I was like, well, I know they sell those in paper, but until I made myself look at it, I didn't think, oh, I should switch that product. So I did. And so my bag went from here to like here in April. I did every 3rd month. And then July was about the same. And then October was like this big. And I weighed it all. And it was all basically like 1.3 pounds, I think. So if I did it for every month, it would be about 4 to 5 pounds a year, which is what most people in this country generally do. So the point of this is not that I'm an angel or that anyone's an angel or that we should try to be angels. We don't need individual people being zero waste perfectly. We need millions of people doing zero waste imperfectly. And we need it to be possible to enable people to do what I was able to do because I had composting available to me right outside the building I was living in. I had the ability to go to a farmer's market across the street and get a CSA to bring a box of unpackaged fresh like food to my door every week. A lot of people don't have that. A lot of our waste is food packaging waste. If we're going to supermarkets all the time, we're going to have more waste. And so we need to redesign systems because we can't just say, oh, you need to buy a Prius and you need to do this and be zero waste. Like, well, not everyone has the money or the access to do these things. And if we care at all about social justice, we need to understand that we need to make those best options, not just available to everyone, but the cheapest options, or if not the only. We shouldn't have bad packaging anymore. So let's just take those options away by getting good laws passed that could do that. Now, Florida, I know it's difficult because you got a state government that wants to only do bad things and they want to take away your right to do good things at the local level. So that's hard on plastics and other things. But there are ways to combat this in a lot of different sectors. And that's what we have to do is make those institutional changes.
Thank you so much, Mike. Gary had a wonderful request. He was asking, he said, you know, what do our next steps look like as a group here today? And I'm asking, and we have your contact information, we're looking at forming up a group of interested folks to work with us with a Beyond Burning local Lee County chapter. And I just want to point out that these incinerators that are in communities, those are decisions that are made by a local municipal government. At one point in time, 30 years ago, our local municipal leaders chose to make Buckingham and Lehigh Acres a frontline community and a sacrifice zone. When they invested that $85 million recently to continue the operation of this 30-year facility, they are continuing to do that. These are local decisions, and that doesn't mean that we have to continue to let that happen, because when we continue to throw like we have, right, and we see our community growing larger and larger every day, and we know that natural disasters, although that waste shouldn't be getting into the incinerator, also adds to that load. Yes, we have a part. We have a part to put in place in our community, a fair and a responsible way to manage our trash so that we don't make a community in our county a frontline community for our trash. So guys, please join us and be a part of Beyond Burning Lee County so that we can move to a more fair and responsible way of managing our trash. And you guys, thank you, Mike, once again.
I don't know if you're all going to the Alcatraz thing next or not, but I'm willing to stick around as long as there are people that have questions for me, so feel free to.
And we'll move out to the
You might
garden.
have to do that outdoors.
Wherever I need to.
I have to leave to go to